People have dubbed the 2024 season to be a season of chaos in college football. And while I understand that belief, and I think that there is evidence to back that up, something that I didn't understand was this belief that chaos in college football would extend to the Michigan versus Oregon matchup in Week 10. That made no sense to me. People talking about Michigan covering the spread against Oregon made no sense to me. Same with those who thought that, well, Indiana might slip up on the road against Michigan State. Just no. The state of Michigan right now is producing bad football, whether it's coaching in Ann Arbor or a lack of talent and rebuilding the roster and program and culture in East Lansing. The issues in Ann Arbor are very clear to me. And this game was the epitome of all of those issues, because while the score of this matchup was closer than the score of Michigan versus Texas, and it didn't feel quite as dominant, the reality of this is that Davis Warren played a near perfect game. Michigan was handed the ball inside of Oregon territory on a muffed punt, and yet lost by 21. And Dan Lanning coached circles around Sharon Moore. Will Stein coached circles around Wink Martindale, but of course, who doesn't coach circles around Wink Martindale? And Kurt Campbell, well, didn't do anything against Tosh Lupoi's defense that I or anyone with an objective sense of thought would care about. So I'm going to dive into this game and talk about it, but I got to be honest with you guys. This is one of those games where, for Michigan and for college football as a whole, I have never and will never be an advocate of the season is over, in the sense of, like, you should just shut down the program and not play games anymore. I hate that. I hate that that's a part of college football now. But when I say the season's over, I mean relative to expectations, you failed. And that's Michigan football right now. Unless they somehow win out and beat Indiana and beat Northwestern and beat Ohio State, the season's a total failure. And Sharon Moore is going to be, and rightfully so, called into question. And as for Oregon, well, we knew they were the number one team entering this game, and I think it's clear they're the number one team after this game. But we'll get into that and some more takeaways. But before we do, I just ask that you subscribe to the channel, that you click the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here on College Football with Sam. Like the video as well to give us a boost into the algorithm so we can get more views, more followers, more watch hours, things that are critical for my success and the success of the channel, and also for your success, so that you can be fed good information from College Football with Sam. Because of you, we are the best college football channel, or going to be the best college football channel on YouTube. We are already the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. So to celebrate our success here, reaching 20,000 subscribers, we will be doing a giveaway at the end of the regular season. So again, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when that goes down, so that you can be a part of it. Comment your reaction to this game down in the comment section below. And also, I actually have a question for you that I want you to answer in the comment section. Do you think Sharon Moore should be fired or not? If so, who's your ideal coach candidate to replace him? And as for Oregon, how confident are you that this team is going to win their first national championship in school history? Answer those down below, and also join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, where we talk college football 24/7, especially on Saturdays. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can donate via YouTube in the comment section below, sign up as a paid member on the Patreon page via the link in the description or down below the pinned comment, or purchase merchandise from our merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, where the link to the Discord server also is, via the description or down below in the pinned comment. But let's get to some basic stats here and then talk about the takeaways for both the Wolverines and the Ducks in this matchup. Oregon did not play a perfect game, but what I will say is they looked bored. I mean, the game was boring to watch. It was boring to watch. There's no other way to go about it. The entire time Oregon was ahead, it felt like maybe if Michigan got a few lucky bounces or played to 105 or 110% of their potential, that maybe they could pull off the upset. But that was just a maybe and kind of a thought in the back of my mind. And honestly, more of a thought of my fandom side. Like, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if Michigan beat Oregon? Objectively, I knew from Oregon's first drive where they scored a touchdown, like, yeah, this game's over. Especially that pass to Evan Stewart. Perfect coverage, but Evan Stewart's an elite wide receiver, so he catches the pass. Oregon dominated Michigan, and they didn't even play to 100% of their potential. This game could have been 45-10. Heck, it maybe could have been 52-10. It could have looked as bad as that Texas game. And in large part, it did. I mean, Oregon averaged 6.6 yards per play. They had a points per play margin of 0.214. That means for every one of Oregon's play compared to every one of Michigan's play, they scored a little over a fifth of a point more. That's critical, especially when Oregon had about a 5-minute possession advantage on the Wolverines. And Michigan, they averaged 5.1 yards per play, which is higher than their season average, or at least around their season average, I believe. And of course, their points per play margin was a negative 0.214. Michigan now, against teams in the Big Ten with a 500 conference record, with the exception of Minnesota, is winless. They beat a Minnesota team who's now 4-2 and playing some really good football. That's easily Michigan's best win, is Minnesota. And Minnesota will finish with a winning record in conference and a winning record overall. No doubts about that. But they lost to 6-3, 3-3 Illinois, 5-4, 3-3 Washington, a Texas squad that is undefeated outside of Georgia, and 9-0, 6-0 Oregon, no surprise, delivers a massive loss. Again, I don't understand why people thought Michigan was going to win here. And I can get to a certain degree why some thought that Michigan would cover, but clearly Oregon intended to come in here and make some type of a statement, even if they didn't play their best game or were a little bit disinterested. That's what that final rushing touchdown symbolized. Oregon wanted to come in here and dominate and own and make a statement, whether they were going to play 100% or not. And they did. They had one turnover, kind of a flukish turnover. They had 2 penalties for 10 yards. Michigan, 5 for 35. Michigan had a dumb challenge reviewing a pass that was already reviewed and incomplete, and they were 4 of 13 on 3rd and 4th down combined. Oregon was 10 of 15. I tell you that Oregon is 10 of 15 on 3rd down exclusively, and they never go for it on 4th down. That is an indicator that Oregon wins, and probably comfortably, covering the spread. And indeed they did. They won by 21 points. They scored more than double the points that Michigan did, winning this game fairly comfortably, on the road, in a new environment that none of their players have played in. And at the end of the game, it was all Oregon fans. It was all green. It was all green and neon yellow. Kind of reminded me of the 2019 Michigan-Ohio State game, where at the end of the game, it's just all scarlet and gray. Just an absolute impressive performance from Oregon, and we'll get to them and my specific takeaways for them later in this video. But first and foremost, I want to talk about Michigan here, briefly. This staff, and I've talked about this with several people, with a Texas fan who's very knowledgeable and is like a professional level bettor, makes a ton of money. I've talked about this now with several Ohio State fans, several of them, with some Michigan State fans. I've had a lot of conversations about this. It becomes clear to me every weekend that if Jim Harbaugh and last year's staff were with Michigan still, this team would be in the running to win the Big Ten. They perhaps would be in the running to win the national title. Though, caveat there. That's why I said perhaps. Because we don't know what they would have done in the portal. We don't know if they maybe would still have 2 losses by now because this roster is very limited. But I imagine they would do more in the portal. There'd be a lot better coaching, better development, better play calling. And really outside of that Texas game, Washington and Illinois, I think Jim Harbaugh and last year's staff would have won fairly easily, comfortably. Michigan played Oregon for whatever reason more competitively than they played Texas. I think a large part of it's just because the team had more time to gel and it was very young and inexperienced at the beginning of the year in multiple places. So Michigan right now could be 8-1 or 7-2. And if they lost to Oregon at home, no big deal. if you're 7-2. I mean, big deal, yeah, but still have a shot to beat Ohio State, still have a shot to beat Indiana. If they're 7-2, we're talking about things very differently. Meanwhile, they're 5-4 right now. They're not reaching the playoff no matter what. They're not reaching Indy. And we knew this. I knew it on the bye week before Illinois. Like, this team is going to go 7-5, 8-4. I had a sense of that even before Michigan lost to Washington. Hey, 7-5, 8-4 football team. Minnesota game told me that. The USC game, the fluky win that was, told me that. The Texas game and re-watching that told me that. This staff has ruined, they have wrecked, they have destroyed, they've decapitated this roster. This Oregon team looks more like the 21, 22, 23 Michigan team than this Michigan team that had several key contributing players to a close to, if not actual greatest of all time caliber team that Michigan had last year. It's coaching. It's not just the roster. Because Davis Warren here, 12 of 21, 164, 2 touchdowns. With last year's staff, Davis Warren, he wouldn't be great. He wouldn't be near elite. But he would be a Cade McNamara level quarterback in 2021. Probably a little bit better because he has more mobility. And he kind of learned under J.J. McCarthy. And I think that this O-line has talent. The tight ends have talent. The receivers have some underrated talent. Not perfect, not even good, I would say, but it may be as good as Penn State's receiving core. And with the defensive talent that Michigan has, it's just, I think that, like, if Michigan had Ohio State's staff, this would be a much better team. And I think that any fan of college football who's knowledgeable and follows this, and any analyst will tell you, a lot of Michigan's wounds, a lot of their hurts, a lot of their hang-ups, a lot of their bad habits, it directly relates back to coaching, like Wink Martindale or Kurt Campbell or Sharon Moore. I mean, how many dumb decisions have to be made before we talk about that this is one of the worst staffs in the Big Ten? Like my Texas friend, Bald Father Bets on YouTube, you can check him out, really good at betting. He told me after the Texas-Michigan game, he was in awe at how bad Michigan's staff was and how much they've wasted this roster. And we still talk about that here. It's the same thing with other Ohio State fans or Michigan State fans or Penn State fans, like any college football fan I interact with. I mean, even like a Minnesota fan or Nebraska fans that I talk to, like, yeah, Michigan's coaching staff is bad. It's obvious to everyone. And you can't pretend. You cannot pretend. It's an absolute must to assess the situation properly and move on. I mean, Penn State with James Franklin, for example. I give Franklin crap, and rightfully so, because, yeah, Ryan Day is one of the best head coaches in college football, but Gus Malzahn beat Nick Saban. He did, often at home, when he was ranked and had good teams. Like, James Franklin needs to beat Ohio State more than once every decade. That has to happen at a blue blood like Penn State. It has to. But James Franklin at least goes on the road and beats USC in overtime. Or last season, at least they blow out Iowa at home. At least in 2022, they go on the road and blow out Auburn. Or they beat a ranked Illinois team at the time in the whiteout at home. They impose their will on them. Or in like 2021, they go on the road and beat a 9-4 Wisconsin team with like close to a generational defense. Or you can go back further in 2017. Very close against a great Ohio State team, against a legendary coach in Urban Meyer. Or 2016. And Franklin is a much larger sample size than Moore. I could also go back to Kirk Ferentz. Kirk Ferentz at least has beaten some great teams at home. And I know, again, Kirk Ferentz, James Franklin, you could even talk about Paul Chryst and his tenure at Wisconsin, much larger sample size than Sharon Moore. But you know what they haven't had that Sharon Moore has? They haven't had 4 first-round players on defense, and yet have fielded a defense that is outside the top 75 in multiple categories. Superior recruiting won't cut it. Recruiting is not the problem. Michigan would be better off with a top 5 head coach. They would be better off with Ryan Day and Day's current staff, even Justin Fry, and a lack of a special teams coordinator, which is something that Day needs to fix, and I think he will. They'd be better off with that and a roster that is just 20th or 15th in talent, like just below that blue chip ratio line that Bud Elliott, states is going to determine who can win the national championship for most of the rest of history. They'd be better off with that than the current recruiting class, even with the 5-star quarterback Bryce Underwood, who may commit to Michigan, that Moore is assembling with Moore's current coaching staff. Look at Florida State, and they're 1-8. Look at Clemson. They can't beat anyone with a pulse. Look at Auburn. Oh, all the recruits talking about how they believe, believe in a team that lost to Cal, that lost to Vanderbilt, that somehow choked to a Missouri team that can't throw a pass, that can't run the football, that really is the Clemson of the SEC, if we're being honest here. Look good against nobodies, can't beat the good teams. Look at Oklahoma. Oklahoma has a top 8 talent roster, and what are they doing with it? Nothing. Their offense is as bad as Iowa's last season, except they have maybe a third of the defense. A third. And look at Billy Napier at Florida. Just complete gutter trash. All of those programs except for Clemson are total gutter trash. Coaching is better than recruiting. Recruiting sometimes makes national championship teams and coaches. I get that. But coaching is a more proven system at winning titles, at conference and national level titles, at having consistent success. Nick Saban and Kirby Smart are elite recruiters because they're elite head coaches, and they understand that having talent to raise your ceiling and raise your floor helps. They do. And then D'Antonio was sort of an outlier historically. Didn't care too much for recruiting, but was still an elite head coach. Ferentz, I think, at one point was that at Iowa. I mean, you're going to have better odds at winning a national title with an elite head coach than you are at assembling an elite recruiting class and relying on that. And if you don't believe me there and say maybe getting an elite head coach is harder than assembling an elite recruiting class, I don't know if I believe that, because there are really only 3 elite rosters, maybe 4 and 5 in the future if Texas and Oregon join Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia. Those are the 3 consistently elite rosters. You see that in NFL draft results. Michigan recently joined them because they were the best developmental program, because they had an elite staff and a head coach who at the end of his tenure in Jim Harbaugh was elite. Recruiting won't cut it. It won't. It absolutely will not. Just go down the road. Ask your friendly neighborhood Ohio State fans. Ask Ryan Day. Has his top 3 recruiting class won him national titles, won him playoff games, or was it his elite game plan that helped him crush Clemson in 2020? Was it his roster talent, or the fact that him, Chip Kelly, and Jim Knowles outcoached James Franklin, Andy Kotelnicki, and Tom Allen that helped them beat Penn State in Happy Valley? You already know the answer to the question. You already do. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, what's the breaking point for Michigan? They allowed 470 yards and 5 touchdowns, a field goal as well. Oregon had 32 minutes and 28 seconds of possession, nearly a 5-minute possession advantage on Michigan. Michigan's defense was on the field constantly. 176 rushing yards were allowed for nearly 5 yards per carry, and Michigan only had 3 TFLs, no sacks. Oregon had 7 TFLs. They also didn't have sacks either. I think Michigan's pass blocking and pass offense in general have been playing a lot better these past 2 weeks objectively, but it's just simply going from terrible to bad or below average or maybe average. But I hope what Davis Warren playing well, and he's playing well, he's playing like a good quarterback right now. I hope that what he's doing is proof positive that it's not just the fact that Michigan's a quarterback and some wide receivers away from winning the Big Ten or even winning it all. If last year's staff was here, I think that would be the talking point. Like, if Michigan had Cam Ward and, they got like Samuel Brown out of the portal and added him to their current room, and then got maybe Silas Bolden, those three players with this current roster and last year's staff, yet national title contender. But that's an alternate reality. That's fantasy. In the real world, now should be the breaking point. It would be better off for Michigan to pony up money to get elite coaches, to get a new head coach, unless Sharon Moore beats one of Indiana or OSU, and maybe that's an unfair opinion of mine. And if they keep him, I'm going to live with it. I want him to succeed. I thought and said that he deserved it after what he did last season in Jim Harbaugh's absence, and also because of the job he did to help build Michigan's O-line into being a dominant force and Michigan's offense into being an efficiency monster. He deserves a shot at the job. But this year was a big shot, and losing the games that he's lost is it's a pretty sad, bloody stain, honestly. Like, there's blood all over the white t-shirt, and you need to clean it off, you need to heal from it, you need to fight back. So those are my thoughts on Michigan, really. And I didn't talk about the game a whole lot, I know that, but what I can tell you is that whenever Oregon ran the ball, they were getting yards after contact. I can tell you that Oregon's receivers were open. They were beating Michigan downfield. I can tell you that Dylan Gabriel was not under pressure. He was not afraid, and he was basically a checkdown merchant for much of the game outside of a few big plays. And that's not me insulting him. That's saying that he didn't have to do all that much. He had a 95.8 QBR. And Oregon's defense, especially their secondary, made good plays. They played a little bit bend but don't break. They don't have an Ohio State or Penn State level defense. They don't. They have some good players, like elite players like Derek Harmon, and I think they have a top 10 defense. It's not quite Penn State or Ohio State's, but their offense, I'm telling you, it's legit. Michigan could learn a lot from Oregon. A lot. But again, players are fantastic. They are. But coaching matters more. Coaching will get you players, and Michigan, as already proven, has the investment. They have the money. They have the resources. What is lacking from Michigan right now is coaching, and that has to change. Let's talk about Oregon, though, because it's pretty boring to talk about a team that already has 4 losses and that, wasted their roster. Because Oregon hasn't wasted anything. They're the number 1 team in the country. This Saturday, they had 294 passing yards. They averaged 8.6 yards per attempt, and they had 1 passing touchdown. And on the ground, they had 176 rushing yards, 4.8 yards per carry. They had 4 rushing touchdowns. Trayshawn Holden stepped up big in this game. 6 receptions, 149 receiving yards, 24.8 yards per reception with a long of 47. You look defensively, and Bryce Betcher had 1.5 tackles for loss, led the team in total tackles. Derek Harmon had 1 big play early where he just got Michigan in the backfield. He's played with Michigan State before, understands Michigan. He's again, faced him off before, probably doesn't like him because that rivalry stuff is instilled. You even saw that with how Quinn Ewers interacted with Michigan in the game in Ann Arbor and also pregame when he referred to him as the team up north. I think Oregon's the best team in the country. I thought that after Illinois. I got a sense that was the case after Ohio State. I think I may even said after the Ohio State game they were the nation's best team because I had Ohio State at number 1. But I forget exactly. This has been a crazy year where it seems like every week there's a team that has an argument to be number 1. No one's invincible this year. Oregon is not invincible, and I think this game showed that a bit with how Michigan had some success on offense. But in my view, they're the closest team nationally to being that invincible. There's so many teams. There's typically one every year. Sometimes there isn't, but 2020 Bama, 2021 Georgia, outside of that one SEC title game, 2022 Georgia, 2023 Michigan, 2022 Ohio State looked invincible for much of their season, 2019 Ohio State for much of the year, 2019 LSU, 2018 Bama until they ran into 2018 Clemson, who at the end of the year felt like the invincible team. You can go on and on and on. There's no team like that this year, and whether it's because of the portal or because it's kind of like 2007, which in 2007 there was absolutely no one who was invincible. So this is not as new as some people think. It could be because of the portal. In large part, I think, regardless of whether the portal was active or not, I think it was in part because basically all top 5 quarterbacks from last year left. along with many starters from those respective rosters. So Oregon, one of the most dominant teams in the country last year, weren't number one last year, but I think last year's team is still better than this year's team because of some key players they lost in the secondary, the offensive line, quarterback, and wide receiver. Georgia, they missed Brock Bowers, generational player. And of course, they also lost some key defensive players as well, who I think they're missing in that secondary. You look at Washington, tons of first rounders. They clearly took a step back. Same thing with Michigan. Not as many first rounders as Washington, but a first round quarterback, several key defensive players, most of their entire starting offensive line and the majority of their two deep offensive line as well, their entire starting receiving core, both linebackers, like a lot of college football's best teams. I mean, look at even Alabama. Lost the majority of their production, close to it. Texas lost their starting receivers and key players on the inside. Like the nation's best teams last year lost a lot of their X Factor talent, with the exception of Ohio State. And even Ohio State lost Marvin Harrison Jr., their best player last year, and two linebackers, and issues there have shown up in the Buckeyes games. So I'm not trying to ramble here, but what I'm saying is it's a down year in football, and Oregon is that one team who I look at and say, they don't remind me of a team that's playing in a down year. They remind me of a team that's playing in a normal year relative for power ratings, and that is a huge advantage. It's a humongous advantage in a year like this. This is a very entertaining year, very back and forth, whether it's clock rules, the portal, or the roster attrition selectively for the top teams that I mentioned. This is a year where if you put 2021 Georgia in, they would probably beat every team by 2 or 3 touchdowns. It would not be close, and it would be a very frustrating year for a lot of teams who ran into that type of team. Out of all the teams in football, this is the one. Ohio State played, I think, their best game of the year offensively against Oregon. And overall, when I rewatched the film to prep for my Penn State versus Ohio State preview, I don't think they played that bad of a game on defense either. I just think that Oregon had better athletes, they had advantages, and they called a great game on offense and exploited an Ohio State defense that had some weaknesses, and Oregon just tore them open. They're a really, really good team. They are. And I think this Saturday showed that with how kind of effortlessly they beat up Michigan here. They dominated them at the line of scrimmage. They had a plus 72 rushing yards differential. Every time they ran, compared to every one time that Michigan ran the ball, Oregon averaged 1 more yard per carry. That's a big deal. Just ask Penn State. Ohio State averaged almost exactly 1 more yard per carry. And that helped them win, helped them control the game. Oregon had 4 more rushing touchdowns, held Michigan to 0 rushing touchdowns. Oregon had 4 more tackles for loss, and they allowed 0 sacks to a defensive line that has Josiah Stewart, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Rayshawn Benny, Derek Moore, etc. It's total dominance. I don't care if Michigan had Jair Hero and Will Johnson. It wouldn't have changed a darn thing. It wouldn't have. Because if you get them, Oregon maybe doesn't fumble that punt, and maybe Michigan holds Oregon to 35 points or to 31 points, or maybe to the same 38, but Michigan scores 7 less points. I mean, they dominated Michigan, and not just in general, but they killed them on the lines of scrimmage, Oregon did. And the Ducks are one of college football's deepest teams. They could be the deepest team in football. And Dan Lanning, in my mind right now, is a top 5 head coach. The Ohio State win and how he managed that game and how he outcoached Ryan Day, one of the best head coaches in the business, informed me of that. And how they're playing right now is just very encouraging. I'd be excited if I'm a Ducks fan. And get to Indianapolis. Games against Wisconsin, games against Maryland and Washington are likely wins. And whether you lose or win in Indianapolis, likely a 12-0 season, undefeated year. And right now I'd favor Oregon over Ohio State. And even if they lost to Ohio State, which is very reasonable, Ohio State's an elite football team, you're 12-1, you'll host a playoff game, likely 13-1, and then do what you can in the college football playoff, which Oregon has not made as a team since the inaugural year of the playoff, the 4-team playoff in 2014. You didn't make it last year, making it this year and at least winning 1 or 2 playoff games, along with going undefeated in your first year of the conference and making it to the championship game of your new conference, that's an achievement. That's something to be proud of. And yeah, their second stringers are stepping up. Noah Whittington's playing well. Trayshawn Holden is playing well. Evan Stewart is fitting in well with the system. Justice Lowe is doing a good job. Kenyon Sadiq is. Terrence Ferguson is back and looking good and healthy. Be praying, by the way, for Tez Johnson. Hopefully he's healthy. I don't know if he's out for the year, how long he's out, but he got injured, and I pray that he can recover safely and that he can come back and play some college football. He's a very good college player, and no matter the skill level of a player or who they are, I think that we always should be praying and hoping for players' health, because it sucks. Like, it sucked when Josh Simmons went down against Oregon. It sucks. You never want to see players get injured in this sport. But Oregon is an elite staff. They have an elite team. And their schedule, they played an elite team. They beat them. And outside of that, yeah, that's the perfect combination. Oregon played an elite team, so they know what their limitations are. They know what their strengths are. They were tested. But outside of that, they've had a pretty easy schedule, which means fewer risk of injuries, fewer risk of L's. It's a schedule that, if you're a Miami fan, for example, like, you wish Virginia Tech beat Vandy, or that they beat Syracuse this past weekend, so that, like, Virginia Tech's a top 25 team and you knew that you beat a team with a pulse. They kind of have that in Louisville, but maybe, like, you wish Louisville beat Notre Dame, or they beat Notre Dame and SMU and you were their only L after they depanted Clemson in their own home stadium, which is a game I may cover. But anyway, Oregon also, in hindsight, is the perfect schedule. Penn State did too. They just missed their opportunity to beat a good team, an elite team in their own home stadium, which Oregon didn't miss. And maybe Penn State will learn from that. But I think Oregon certainly has. I think they've gotten better since facing off against Ohio State in Autzen Stadium. And my MVP of the game is Dylan Gabriel, 22 of 34, 294 passing yards, 3 attempts for 23 yards on the ground, and 2 total touchdowns. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Top 5 in QBR, just like he was last year, even with his slow start this year. Top 5 in QBR, guys. He's a really good college QB. And if not for that performance against Idaho, Oregon would be top 5 in FPI right now. Like, those power ratings, they should abandon. They should abandon their Oregon game against Idaho in terms of including that in their sample, because this is a different team now. They weren't healthy then. They, for whatever reason, just weren't finishing drives, couldn't run the ball. This is a different team compared to that game. The weaknesses that were displayed in that game, I'd say, are close to gone. So if you want to be accurate, discount what you saw against Idaho. Count what you saw against Boise State, because Boise State has some legitimate players. So I think you can count that. You can count any weaknesses you saw against Ohio State. But this is one of the best teams in the country right now. And the fact that they're not top 4, top 3, or top 2 in power ratings is ridiculous. It's because of that one game against Idaho where they fell like 10 spots after one game. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Conolula OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Drugans, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Please check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Blue, and go Ducks.